It's a very interesting thing that you say, because many people in India believe there has to be bold policy making which would take grand steps. In some senses, this has to be a budget of the big gesture. You are actually arguing that it doesn't need to be a budget of the big gesture. It has to be an incremental, small changes, tread water, hold status quo kind of budget. What is the basic principle behind arguing that?
Well, the short-term macroeconomic situation is not clear.
Right.
We are very much in transition. The recovery in US is early days, rather fragile, hasn't happened in UK at all. France and Germany, it has happened. But in the OECD countries, things are not clear that we have decisively turned the corner, and we are really we're not yet above the last peak.
Right.
Okay, we may get there, not our last peak. And I reckon that through 2010, the American economy is going to remain fragile. It really not clear that employment will start rising in American economy till about the third quarter of 2010. Hopefully in time for the next election for Obama. But that is not quite certain. Where I would recommend boldness is in things which are in the medium to long run.
Like what?
Budget, debt.
Debt.
I think it really is time to stop all pretense that somehow deficits are Keynesian or for the armed army and all. That's all complete nonsense. India used to have a very sound budgetary policy in the 50s. Every budget produced a surplus on the revenue account. Every budget produced when India was much poorer.
That's right.
And sometime in the 1970s, the whole discipline went. I think there's absolutely no reason why India should have a deficit on its budget, why it should not have a surplus, and why it should not promise boldly to say we shall get the debt GDP ratio down to X%, where X is definitely below 50%, but perhaps below 40%.
You're essentially saying this budget must be a budget of discipline and not necessarily drama.
Yeah, it has to give a sustainable and credible promise that Indian fiscal situation will get very healthy very soon. And I really don't see that it should be so much subject to the political cycle, so that people, when they listen to the finance minister, think, I know he's saying that, but when the next election comes, the spout will be open again. So some kind of credible message that...
In your mind, what could that message constitute?
Well, ideally...
You've spoken of disinvestment, that's why.
Yeah, ideally what I would like is a 10-year projection of how disinvestment will reduce the stock of the debt, and prudent policies on spending and taxation will reduce the deficit to zero.
Correct.
Now, and I really want India to be able to get into the big league where fiscal responsibility is a norm. I know due to last 2 years, a lot of fiscal stimulus in the developed countries has made the debt GDP ratio very high. I think it's unsustainable. But as they are all going to be deflating quite rapidly, I think it's very important that we, as not just an emerging nation, but now beginning to be a powerful nation, stop all this nonsense about budgetary looseness. And I think if, ideally I would like, I don't think it's going to happen, ideally I would like a statutory body to be set up to pronounce on government's budgetary position every year. The independent statutory body which will say this will not do. Now that is too much to ask for, that will require legislation and so on. But Pranab Mukherjee has got that kind of credibility.
To push it through.
And, or if he can say that within the next X years we will get such systems set up, and I give you a promise that over the next 10 years regardless of which party is in power, the time path of fiscal deficit would be zero, the end is zero, and the debt GDP ratio will get down to below 50%.
Right.
So that, in a sense, he would commit himself very rapidly to either divest sufficiently to reduce the debt, or promise a surplus on revenue account in the budget.
Right.
I very strongly believe that kind of signal would immensely ease the financing situation for the private sector.
Right.
Because the private, we have a very weak corporate debt market.
That's right.
We need a proper corporate debt market, and eventually even the small and medium enterprises are squeezed out because the government is a big player in the bond market.
Yes.
Now, we can't go on pretending that this is necessary.
Yes.
Indian numbers are now looking so healthy in terms of growth rate, in terms of revenues coming in, that it really is now time to prune spending. Really, I'm not against all spending, but the government must have within its budget an easy room for about 10% spending cut.
Right.
Maybe not this year, but over the next, from 2011 onwards, if a path can be laid down, and with some kind of legislative backing. I know we've been through ones before, and we had a fiscal responsibility thing, and that was easily laid aside. So, which is why I would like statutory thing, either the Finance Commission to comment or something like that. But definitely, I would like India to be able to give its own citizens and the world a signal that India is going to be fiscally responsible.
Let me ask you, some people argue that some of the fiscal laxity, as it were, comes from the fact that India wants inclusive growth, and that involves spending money in places that might not immediately help fiscal prudence.
No,
is that a lax argument?
It's a completely lax argument because substantial subsidies are not spent for the poor, but spent for the middle classes.
Right.
Again and again, Suripto Mandal and Rao long ago showed that. But I have argued, for example, that a petrol subsidy, which the government is trying to get under control, is really very, very large. There is no need for a petrol subsidy. It's really no need for petrol subsidy. And quite a lot of the fertilizer subsidy, the water subsidy, the petrol subsidy are actually not about inclusive growth.
Right.
They are about distortions in the growth process, distortion in the distribution system, where you are giving money to people who least need it.
That's right.
They may be politically powerful, they may be your friends, they may be donors to the party machine, but they're actually not part of an inclusive growth strategy.
That's right.
And if you want to have money for inclusive growth, I would even say that the effectiveness of money spent on BPL or whatever else you want to do should be enhanced by making it much more transparent. Right. I long ago began advocating direct cash transfers to the poor.
Right.
I'm not a believer in Food Security Act. I'm not a believer in underpricing wheat and rice. I think all that leads to waste. Far too much food is wasted in India on the ground of inclusion. And far too much money is wasted which doesn't get to the poor. I mean, we know this. It may not be as bad as when Rajiv Gandhi said, but it's pretty bad. Right. So I think you really need a very tough examination to say inclusive growth does not justify laxity of the budgetary process.
So even as the drums have begun to beat outside where we are standing, you're essentially saying a more joyous decade for writing and publishing.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Don't believe any of the doomsayers.